Hello, today is Thursday, May 10th, 2018. I'm Joe Schmidt with TC2, and this is Staying Connected. I'm here today with Andrew Brown, Managing Partner of LB3, and he is also the Chairman of TC2. And on today's podcast, we are going to talk about wireless signal boosters.
Yes, we are.
All right, so Andrew, what's going on and why do our clients care?
Well, Joe, you may have heard that in 2018, reliable wireless service is kind of a business necessity.
Yes, I have heard that. You know, nobody comes to TC2 these days and asks if we can negotiate a wireless service deal where the coverage is, so-so, maybe some calls get dropped, and perhaps there are some dead zones in the middle of the office park. But seriously, wireless is a core service that kind of has to work everywhere at all times.
Exactly. Not a luxury service anymore. But even though wireless coverage is improving across the country and the globe for that matter, there still are a lot of noticeable large areas, particularly in business locations, where calls get dropped or wireless devices don't connect to the network. And it's unbelievably frustrating for end users. So the traditional solution, as you know, has always been the installation of something like a distributed antenna system. But those are quite expensive, and they're a huge hassle to install.
And it also can be overkill for relatively small coverage problems.
Absolutely. So enter the commercial off-the-shelf signal boosters that you can buy at an electronics store. These are the devices that offer a relatively cheap and effective way for businesses to improve wireless coverage in their facilities. But the regulations that govern the use of these types of devices may not really permit businesses to deploy them in the most obvious and useful way.
All right, so the obvious question here is why not?
Obvious, but it's a good question. So here's what happened. About 5 years ago, the FCC decided to adopt some rules that would promote the use of these signal boosters. And they figured this would be a good way to increase wireless coverage. But they were really concerned that these devices might cause network interference with the wireless carrier's licensed spectrum. And, it might solve one problem of wireless coverage, but make another one worse by creating interference issues. So they adopted a bunch of rules that divided the signal booster world of products into these two parts. They called the devices in one part industrial signal boosters and in the other part consumer signal boosters.
What's the difference?
Well, it's kind of what you'd expect. Industrial signal boosters are basically what we think of as DAS, these big professionally installed systems, things that go into places like sports stadiums or huge office buildings. And in those cases, the company installing the booster goes and gets specific permission from the wireless carrier to operate the booster in the carrier's licensed spectrum. And that way the carrier knows how to contact them or the business if there are interference issues. It's a very customized solution.
So then what are consumer signal boosters?
Well, the FCC kind of conceived consumer signal boosters as something that a regular residential user might go and buy at their local electronics store. These are the off-the-shelf plug-and-play devices that you might put in your house just to get better coverage on your third floor or whatever. But to operate a device in licensed spectrum, where all the wireless carriers are, you have to have the carrier's permission. So the question is, how do you get that consent for a bunch of consumer devices that don't have any real relationship with a particular carrier? And if you do have a million of these things out there and some are causing interference, how's any wireless carrier going to find the source to shut it off?
So how they deal with that?
Well, so the FCC adopts a bunch of rules that require these devices to first meet a minimum technical standard, which was developed with the wireless carriers, and it was designed to eliminate a lot of the risk of interference, something called the Network Protection Standard, or NPS. But the FCC then also requires the consumer to actually register the device. So you pull it out of the box, and you have to go to a carrier's website and give them some info before you can start using it. And that way they can find you if the device causes some problems. But then it turns out the FCC did something that created other problems for businesses.
And what was that?
Well, so in the rules they adopted, they specify that consumer signal boosters are limited to personal use.
What does that mean?
Well, it's not exactly clear, and that's what's created a lot of problems for enterprise users. So like I said earlier, it turns out that so-called consumer boosters actually work really well for businesses of all sizes. Schools and libraries and hospitals, all kinds of places. For example, we have a client that wants to deploy a lot of these boosters in a very large single building location of theirs to basically improve coverage where its carrier won't put in another tower, and it doesn't want or need to spend the money on a big DAS system because a bunch of consumer signal boosters would work just fine.
So they'd be using it for business use, which is not personal, and therefore that's against the rules?
That's right. So we, along with some other interested folks, including the manufacturers of these devices and some really well-known companies like UPS, joined voices by each filing public comments and working with the SEC to get rid of this personal use restriction, basically letting the SEC know that enterprise customers really do have a use for these types of devices, and the rules restricting that use to some kind of ill-defined personal use really undermines the SEC's goals of expanding wireless coverage as quickly and cheaply as possible.
So what's the situation now?
Well, it's slowly improving. Remember, the FCC is very cautious about doing anything that might increase the likelihood of anything that's going to cause interference. So in March, they took a half step forward by eliminating the personal use restriction for certain types of consumer signal boosters.
But not all, so which ones got left behind?
Well, kind of the ones that matter. So the FCC eliminated the restriction for what are called single provider consumer signal boosters. Those are boosters that amplify the signal for a single carrier. But they left the personal use restriction in place for what are called multi-band boosters, meaning those that can boost the signal for more than one provider.
So those sound a lot more useful to businesses.
Yeah, well, they are.
So is there any chance that the personal use restriction for multi-band boosters will go away?
Well, we're working on that right now. So one of the issues that the FCC is looking into is how to register a multi-band device with all the carriers whose licensed spectrum the booster would be operating in. Some of the options are kind of bad, though, like forcing the end user, the business that's using the booster, to go and register separately with every wireless carrier. Or they're talking about possibly imposing registration fees on consumers or businesses so that wireless carriers can maintain these registration records and share them. And that would really, really reduce the cost effectiveness of consumer signal boosters, not to mention compliance with the registration requirements, because who wants to be bothered with that level of registration and effort? So we want to make sure that that kind of bad end result isn't there.
So what can businesses do to participate and stay informed?
Good question. So it's always important for the FCC to hear from enterprise consumers, and they never get enough of that. They're always interested in what business customers have to say, but there just aren't that many opportunities or interest for business customers to go in front of the FCC. So we represent a phenomenal organization of enterprise customers called the Ad Hoc Telecom Users Committee. And it's always working on these issues and keeping its members informed of the inside scoop about what's happening at the FCC that affects the price of services that businesses need to buy. And this is a great example of that. So it's a great way for companies to make sure their business voices are heard when these cost and service affecting issues come up. And they come up all the time.
You know, I've said on these podcasts previously, every business customer should join Ad Hoc.
I agree. It's really the only coherent voice of business users at the FCC. So the more voices that participate in it, the louder business customers' voice is and can be heard.
All right. Well, that was really informative and interesting. And I want to thank you, Andrew, for sharing all that really good information. And if you, the listening audience, have any questions for Andrew, feel free to email him at abrown@lb3law.com. And you can stay current on this topic, on other mobile service developments, and much more by checking out our websites at techcaliber.com and lb3law.com, and by following us on LinkedIn. Hey, Andrew, before I let you go, you're jetting off to London next week for a TC2 and LB3 conference in the UK, aren't you?
Indeed I am. So LB3 and TC2 are hosting a conference on the afternoon of May 15th in London next week. We're going to be covering the hot topics in network and infrastructure deals for enterprise customers. Totally free to attend, so if companies have any of their folks in London that want to join us for the afternoon, let us know soon.
All right, there's a lot more information on our websites and at the link that came with this podcast email announcement if you're on our mailing list. All right, that's all for this podcast. Stay tuned for more Staying Connected podcasts that will be coming your way soon.